In today's news, we find one of the most privileged, influential, wealthy, and ridiculously watered down and jellyfish spine pastors in America. Rick Warren claimed that churches aren't being persecuted because of COVID restrictions. Now, yesterday we explained to you from the pages of Protestia that a church in California had been fined $1 million on account of worshiping in the midst of a pandemic. John MacArthur has been taken to court I don't know how many times, but you can walk into a pot dispensary or a strip club. You just can't worship in places like Nevada. Churches have tried to get around the rules by worshiping in a casino. Those are wide open, and yet the governor and the various courts of Nevada have said, no, you can gamble in a casino, but you can't worship God there. We're seeing police departments, a squad of 9 police officers in another state in the American South inside the Bible Belt shutting down a church of only 10 worshipers. Yeah, that's what you call, what's the word for it? Persecution. That's right. You can see this post over at Protestia. Rick Warren says that churches aren't being persecuted by COVID restrictions. He would know about persecution, right? The most loved pastor in America who's never stood up for anything ever. Well, in an interview with Stephen String at Relevant Magazine, Rick Warren, the lead pastor and overseer of a 25,000 member quote-unquote church with 14 campuses, those are called churches, by the way, last seen having a racially segregated service so that the quote black fold can have a safe space to quote heal. That's right, that was last week. Rick Warren had a worship service in which white folks were not included. There's a word for that. It's called racism. Well, Rick Warren now says that churches that have gathered for worship being shut down by the government are not being persecuted. He says COVID revealed a fundamental weakness in the church. Most churches only have one purpose, worship. And if you take, by the way, yeah, that's like pretty important to what a church does. He says if you take worship away, you've got nothing. And they're in a hurry to get back to worship because that's all that they've got. That's all that we have. The singing of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, the taking of the Lord's Supper and receiving as a means of grace the metaphoric body and blood of Christ, the baptism of new believers, the preaching and teaching of God's word. That's all we've got. He says Saddleback is built not on one purpose, but on 5. He's purpose-is driven. He's not purpose-driven. Purpose is driven. He says if you take one circle out, we've still got 4 other circles. He says we've got ministry going on, we've got missions going on, we've got fellowship going on, we've got discipleship going on. Those all stand on their own. He says you could take one thing away, but our church didn't shut down. We've led over 16,000 people to Christ since March. At which point all of God's people says, sure you did. What he means is he had them repeat after him a superstitious incantation, probably for the 4th time this month, and called it a salvation. He says we're in revival. We're averaging 80 people a day coming to Christ. 80 people a day. It reminds me of what the Pharisees were told, that they were crossing land and sea to make converts who are twice the sons of hell that they are. This is actual persecution. And the only ones who are not seeing it at this point would be, well, men like Rick Warren.